Imagine ruling the most powerful empire on earth, surrounded by marble palaces, legions of soldiers, and a city that worships you like a god. And yet, every time you close your eyes, you see daggers waiting in the dark. This was the life of Domitian, the emperor Rome tried to erase from history. He was the son who grew up in the shadow of greatness, the ruler who expanded the empire and filled its coffers, and the paranoid tyrant who trusted no one, not even his own family. His story is not one of glory but of fear, betrayal, and the ultimate humiliation, a name condemned to be forgotten. But what kind of man builds temples that still stand today, while his memory is cursed forever? Let's step into the world of Domitian, the emperor who demanded to be called a god, until the people who bowed before him turned on him with knives. Domitian was never supposed to be the center of Rome's story. He was the younger son, the boy who stood in the shadow of others, his father Vespasian, the general who clawed his way up from a humble beginning to become emperor, and his elder brother Titus, the golden child, the man everyone in Rome seemed to adore. From the start, Domitian learned what it felt like to be overlooked. When Vespasian seized power in the chaos after Nero's fall, Domitian was young, just 20. The empire was unstable, and Rome's elite didn't quite know what to make of him. Titus was already proving himself in the field, leading campaigns in Judea, earning glory with every triumph. Domitian, on the other hand, was kept back in Rome, dressed in togas and paraded at ceremonies, the son who represented continuity, but not strength. He smiled when he was told to smile. He waved when the people expected him to wave, but inside, resentment began to take root. Still, those early years gave him something valuable. He watched. Domitian studied the Senate, the generals, the courtiers who whispered behind marble walls. He noticed how power worked in Rome, how loyalty could be bought, how enemies hid daggers behind polite words, and how quickly crowds turned their cheers into curses. By the time his father consolidated control, Domitian had developed a sharp sense of survival. He might not have been the star, but he was no fool. When the Jewish revolt ended with Titus's victory, all eyes turned to the older brother. Titus marched through Rome in a triumph, showing off treasures from Jerusalem, cheered like a god. Domitian watched from the sidelines, clapping with the crowd, his face calm, but inside he was burning. He was ambitious. He wanted his own glory, his own empire. But he knew Rome wasn't ready to hand it to him. Then fate intervened. In 79 CE, Titus became emperor after Vespasian's death. His reign, though short, was marked by disasters. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius, a massive fire in Rome, a devastating plague. And then, in 81 CE, Titus died suddenly, after only 2 years on the throne. Some whispered poison. Others blamed the gods. Whatever the cause, Domitian became emperor at just 30 years old. The younger son, the one Rome had underestimated, now wore the purple. At first, he presented himself as a humble ruler. He promised justice, stability, and fairness. He spoke of honoring the memory of his father and brother, of ruling with wisdom. But behind those promises was a man who had spent years in the shadows, learning how fragile power really was. He was determined never to lose it. And so began the reign of Domitian, a ruler who would expand Rome's borders, strengthen its defenses, and try to shape the empire into his vision. But deep within him, that old resentment, that sense of being overlooked and underestimated, would grow into something darker, something that would one day consume him. Domitian was no longer the forgotten son. He was the emperor, but the ghosts of his past would never let him rest. When Domitian first sat on the throne, many doubted him. He had no record of commanding legions, no triumphs carved into marble, no heroic stories sung in the streets. To the Senate, he was an untested boy who had suddenly inherited an empire. To the army, he was the brother of a general they admired but did not follow into battle. Domitian knew the whispers, and he knew Rome expected him to fail, but he surprised them. Almost immediately, Domitian set out to prove he was more than a shadow of his father and brother. He wasn't a soldier at heart, but he understood that Rome's strength came from its frontiers. He poured money into the legions, raising their pay and rewarding loyalty. The soldiers noticed. To them, this emperor was different. He valued them, not just as pawns of the Senate, but as the backbone of Rome itself. Beyond Rome, the empire was always restless. The northern borders along the Rhine and the Danube were under constant pressure from Germanic tribes. Domitian traveled there in person, standing before his troops in gleaming armor, addressing them as comrades rather than subjects. It was more theater than strategy. His generals handled the real fighting. But the soldiers believed him. They marched under his name, and victories on the frontier became his victories. Slowly, Domitian began to build the image he craved, not just an emperor, but a conqueror. In the city, he turned his eye to walls and stones. Rome had always been a place where emperors built monuments to outlast themselves, and Domitian was no exception. He rebuilt the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, destroyed years earlier in the civil wars. He added new forums, theaters, and palaces. Marble glittered under the sun, columns rose high, and Rome looked renewed. To the people, Domitian was a benefactor. Bread and games flowed, festivals multiplied, and the city seemed alive again. Even in administration, Domitian was sharp. He cracked down on corruption, demanding strict accounting from provincial governors. Taxes were enforced with a severity that frightened the Senate, but filled the imperial treasury. He introduced reforms to stabilize coinage, ensuring Rome's economy held strong. For the common people, life under Domitian was, at least in the beginning, stable and prosperous. But all of this, the soldiers' loyalty, the monuments, the reforms, wasn't just governance. It was theater, a way for Domitian to prove his worth. He was the emperor who gave Rome strength, who expanded its borders, who left behind stone and marble as proof that he was no mere accident of fate. Yet, even as his achievements piled up, so too did his insecurities. He demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. He relished the worship, the flattery, the sense that finally no one could overlook him. But it wasn't enough. Every cheer sounded to his ears like a cover for whispered mockery. Every senator's bow looked like a mask hiding betrayal. The more he rose, the more he feared the fall. And that fear would soon twist Domitian's reign from glory into terror. At first, Rome celebrated Domitian's strength. The people enjoyed the games he funded. The soldiers cheered his name, and the city glittered with new monuments. But beneath the surface, cracks began to spread. Power that had once been a shield for Domitian slowly became a mirror, showing him his deepest fears. Domitian had never trusted the Senate. To him, they were not guardians of tradition, but a nest of vipers, men who smiled in public and plotted in private. He remembered how senators had abandoned emperors before him, even his own father, when it suited their ambitions. Domitian would not give them the chance to betray him. He began watching them closely, punishing even the smallest hint of disrespect. A poorly chosen word, a rumor whispered too loudly, a senator who hesitated to bow deeply enough. These were no longer minor slights. Under Domitian, they were treason. Trials filled the courts. Senators were accused of conspiracy, of plotting against the emperor, of insulting his divine title. Confessions were extracted, often under torture. Executions became spectacles, not in the arena, but in the Senate itself. One by one, the old families of Rome learned to lower their voices and keep their eyes on the floor when Domitian entered. The once proud Senate became a chamber of silence and fear, but paranoia doesn't stop at politics. Domitian began to see threats everywhere, in the shadows of his palace, in the laughter of courtiers, even in his own household. He surrounded himself with spies, men whose only loyalty was to his fear. They listened at doors, carried whispers to the emperor, and made entire families tremble with a single report. Rome became a city of informants. Friends no longer trusted each other. A careless word could end in exile, prison, or death. Domitian's cruelty spread beyond the elite. He demanded absolute obedience from everyone. When he presided over games, he forced the crowd to cheer him, not just the gladiators. He punished minor offenses with severity, banishments, heavy fines, public humiliations. To the people, he was no longer the generous young emperor who had given them festivals. He was a ruler to be feared, a man whose eyes seemed to pierce into the soul of anyone who stood before him. And yet, he believed it was all necessary. In his mind, he wasn't cruel, he was cautious. He wasn't paranoid, he was realistic. He told himself that enemies lurked everywhere, that only through strict control could the empire survive. But in truth, Domitian's empire was no longer built on loyalty. It was built on fear. The more he tightened his grip, the more alone he became. Senators despised him. Courtiers obeyed him only out of terror. Even the people who once cheered his name began to whisper in secret. What kind of emperor demands to be called a god? What kind of ruler kills his friends to keep himself safe? Domitian thought he was securing his throne. In reality, he was digging his own grave. By the final years of Domitian's reign, the palace no longer felt like a home. It felt like a fortress. Its marble halls echoed with silence, its gilded chambers guarded by men who feared their emperor almost as much as they served him. Domitian rarely smiled. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for signs of betrayal. Every banquet, every council meeting, every whisper in the corridors left him wondering who among them was waiting for the moment to strike. And he was right to be afraid. His reign of fear had made him many enemies. Senators who had seen their colleagues executed, generals who had been stripped of command, even members of his own household. Every one of them had a reason to see him fall. What Domitian could not imagine was that the dagger would come from the very people who stood closest to him. It began with whispers inside the palace. His wife, Domitia Longina, once banished but later recalled, was said to have grown weary of his suspicion and cruelty. Courtiers who had spent years bowing to him in public began to plot in secret. And most dangerous of all, the servants, the men and women who dressed him, who carried his messages, who stood at his doors, saw that Rome itself would not mourn if the emperor were gone. The plot was simple and ruthless. One morning in September of 96 CE, Domitian went about his routine in the palace, believing himself secure within its walls. He was 50 years old, hardened by decades of power and paranoia, yet vulnerable in the one place he thought untouchable, his own chambers. A servant handed him a document to sign. As he leaned over it, another slipped a dagger from his robe. Domitian fought. Ancient accounts say he struggled fiercely, trying to wrestle the blade away, calling out for help that never came. But it was no use. The conspirators had planned too well. One after another, they stabbed him, until the paranoid ruler who had lived in fear of betrayal finally fell to the very fate he had dreaded all his life. The news of his death spread quickly through Rome, and instead of grief, there was relief. The Senate, long humiliated and oppressed, wasted no time. They declared Domitian's memory cursed. His statues were smashed, his name chiseled from inscriptions, his images defaced. It was the dreaded damnatio memoriae, the erasure of an emperor's existence from the record of Rome. But memory cannot truly be erased. Even as marble was shattered, stories of Domitian lived on. Some remembered the builder of temples, the protector of legions, the man who had strengthened Rome's borders. Others remembered the tyrant, the paranoid ruler who had filled the city with fear. In the end, Domitian achieved a kind of immortality, though not the one he craved. He would not be worshipped as a god, but remembered as a warning, a ruler who had everything, yet lost it all to the fear that consumed him. When Domitian's body was dragged away from the palace, Rome did not fall into chaos. Instead, it breathed. The Senate met in a rush, no longer trembling under the emperor's glare, and voted to condemn him with the harshest punishment Rome could give. Damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. His statues were torn down, his face carved away from reliefs, his name erased from public inscriptions. Where once he had demanded to be called Lord and God, now his very name was forbidden to be spoken with respect. It was as if Rome itself tried to pretend he had never existed. For a man who had lived obsessed with control, who wanted to be remembered as divine, this was the final humiliation. And yet even as Rome tried to erase him, Domitian's shadow remained. The soldiers on the frontiers did not forget how he had raised their pay and strengthened their defenses. The common people remembered the games, the festivals, and the grain distributions that had once made their lives easier. And historians writing in the decades after painted conflicting pictures. Some called him a tyrant. Others admitted he had ruled with competence, even brilliance, before paranoia destroyed him. Domitian's reign became a lesson carved into the memory of Rome, not in stone, but in fear. He showed how power, when mixed with insecurity, could twist into cruelty. He showed how an emperor could expand an empire's borders, fill its treasury, and build monuments that touched the sky, yet still be hated by the very people he ruled. For the Senate, Domitian was a tyrant whose memory deserved to be crushed. For the people, he was a contradiction, both protector and persecutor. For the soldiers, he was a commander who valued them more than the aristocrats in togas. And for history, he was a warning that a ruler who governs through fear may keep power for a time, but fear never builds loyalty. It only builds enemies. Domitian had dreamed of eternal glory, of being remembered alongside Augustus and Trajan as one of Rome's great emperors. Instead, his legacy was darkness. He was remembered not as a god, but as the man who trusted no one, who saw daggers in every shadow, and who finally fell to daggers in his own home. And so, in the marble ruins of Rome, his story lingers. His temples still stand, though his name has been scratched away. His palaces still stretch across the Palatine Hill, though his likeness has been broken. The stone remains, but the man is gone. Domitian wanted immortality. What he found instead was infamy. Domitian built monuments, secured Rome's borders, and demanded to be called a god. But fear ruled him more than power ever did. Betrayed in his own palace and cursed by damnatio memoriae, his legacy became a warning. Fear may control people for a time, but it never secures loyalty.